You're listening to the Loudoun Museum podcast. I'm Sarah Wolfley, and while I may not know all the ins and outs of public history, I'm on this journey with you to uncover the rich stories of our community. Together, we'll explore the fascinating history that's right in our backyard and hopefully spark a sense of pride in where we live. Let's dive into the past and discover what makes Loudoun County so special. Welcome to the Loudoun Museum podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Wolfley. In today's episode, we explore the intriguing history of the Eliza House, a significant landmark in our community. Recently restored by Sharon Verts, our board's president, the house was previously known as the Lynch House, named after its former owners, and has become known for its fascinating stories of otherworldly encounters. Joining us are Rick and Debbie Eder, longtime storytellers of Loudoun Hauntings. Rick, who has also served as a history educator for the museum, and Debbie both bring personal experiences with the paranormal to our conversation. Their commitment to sharing these stories over the years speak to their passion for our local history. Thank you so much for joining our podcast, Rick and Debbie. I'm so excited to have you.
We're pleased to be here.
We're going to start off with a little bit of an icebreaker question. So the question is, if you could stay in any haunted location for a night, where would it be and why?
It's a toss-up
Okay.
between Eliza's house and Glenfiddich,
The Eliza House.
preferably on the second floor if we stayed there, because that's where Eliza normally hangs out, or over at Glenfiddich house, because I feel sort of a connection with Colonel Burt. One of the few years that I did not do the Eliza house, I did Glenfiddich, and the same night, and we'll tell this story later, the same night that was the anniversary of the Balls Bluff battle, the young lady and I who were doing the storytelling, we went inside and we saw the blood stain on the floor at the foot of the stairs, because it's not always there. And so we figured, well, okay, it's the anniversary of the battle. Let's look.
Yeah.
And sure enough, there it was. But Colonel Burt's not real active at night. Sometimes he is. Usually he's a daytime ghost.
One year we were doing them and it fell on our anniversary. And they didn't have anybody to do the tours. And he's like, they don't have anybody. And I'm like, okay, fine, but you owe me big time. We went there and one of the girls that was working for the museum came in, and you're not allowed to take pictures when you're on the tour. But she was taking pictures, took a picture of the two of us on the steps, and there's an orb right over Rick's shoulder. So I know Eliza's in love with him. She gets mad when he's not there. So she wanted to be in the picture with him.
Oh my goodness.
And it's on one of the coffee mugs that they sell here too.
Oh, really? Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll have
Yeah,
to.
the coffee mugs that they have here, there's a little picture of Debbie and I standing on the staircase. And if you look over my left shoulder, there's a little orb there.
I also did see the one from last year of the storytellers at Glenfiddich, where there's two storytellers, and then in the middle there looks like there's a figure listening in. I don't know.
Yeah, we saw that. Remember, somebody showed us their picture.
Yeah.
So the first question I have for you guys is, what inspired you guys to become a storyteller for Hauntings?
Well, we started back in the 90s. It was more of a theatrical presentation than it was the history and the actual spiritual stuff. And we had some friends at the museum and the next year they said, well, hey, do you want to do this? And it's like, well, okay, sure, why not? Sounds like fun. So, we sort of fell into it by accident. But we started, and we started at the Lynch House. Well, it was called the Lynch House then, and that's where we started, along with Laura. She was the main person who had been doing it. She had been doing it for a few years. Um, and then when retired, um, then we became the full-time Eliza custodians, so to speak.
Did you guys believe in kind of ghosts during that time, or were you just kind of more interested in the history and that's what made you like, you know, become the storytellers? Like, what was it that really hooked you guys into wanting to join?
Well, it was both,
Mm-hmm.
because I'm a history nut,
Mm-hmm.
um, and um, I've I've been to I spent a lot of time like up in Gettysburg and Sharpsburg, all the burgs in Virginia where the Civil War went on. Um, and I can see a connection. I can sit on the stone wall on Cemetery Ridge at Gettysburg and watch Pickett's charge. I don't know, maybe it's a connection or something, but um and then because I never really, when people talk about ghosts, everybody thinks, like Casper the ghost and stuff like that. And it's like, it's not really that, but it's like, especially in wartime, somebody who dies, sometimes they die so suddenly that they don't really know they're dead. And so they come back. I mean, I've seen spirits at Gettysburg
Mm-hmm.
and a few other places. In the beginning, she wasn't that into it.
Mm-hmm.
I started dragging her along to
Mm-hmm.
reenactments and everything else, and then you know once she got into it and did a little research and everything else, and but I don't think she was quite as into it as much in the beginning here as I was. But she quickly figured it out, especially after a couple times up at Lynch House.
Right.
Well, I'm not a public speaker.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the hardest thing was to get up in front. But after you do it the first time,
Yeah.
and I took the script to work and used it on everybody at work to make sure I knew what I was saying.
Yeah.
And I used to sit back in the one room and scare people to death because I just sit there and listen to him. And then I moved and everybody would jump, and I'm like, it's me, I'm real.
And she got to like that part. She didn't really have a speaking
Nope.
part.
I
She was
like that
just
part.
she was just sort of there,
Right.
and
Heard
she
it
was
so
in
much.
she was in period clothing.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at the Lynch house, okay, if you go into the foyer, to the right is what we used to call the music room, and the parlor was on the left.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the only lights that we would have on in the house would be in the foyer. So
Mm-hmm.
she'd be sitting back in the parlor on a settee that was sort of out of everybody's line of sight,
Mm-hmm.
but if she moved, they could sense movement.
I guess I know why people want to go back every year to the tour and listen to the story, even if they've already heard it, they like to come back. But for a storyteller, what was it about being a part of Hauntings that made you guys want to come back?
First of all, it was fun.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we used to do it for 2 weekends in a row, 2 3-day weekends in a row. Part of it was that, and as after the first time or two at Eliza House, um, we sort of developed a connection with it. And uh, when it's become when we do the house, it the first thing I do when I walk inside is I greet Eliza, and the last thing I do is tell her good night or goodbye, I'll see you next year. We looked forward to it, and just to go in and, catch up, see what's happened during the previous year
Yeah.
and everything. Because the previous owners, the Lynches,
Mr. Lynch would show up and tell us stuff that had happened
yeah,
during the year. So we always incorporated this in the story.
he'd update us on stuff that had happened. Occasionally, Mrs. Lynch would tell us some stuff. But it's interesting because every night on the hauntings, when the hauntings were coming in, they would leave.
Yeah.
And they'd get out of Dodge. So the only people in the house was Debbie and myself and Eliza. And there's actually it's more than just Eliza in the house. So, but so as the years went through, we had that connection, and it was just you know we expected to be when the museum said, "Hey, are you going to do hauntings this year?" We'd say yes, fully expecting they're going to put us back to Lynch House because nobody else did Lynch House. That's our house.
Right. From being someone who grew up in Ashburn to like knowing about the hauntings, I feel like your stop was so well known that it made people like the reputation of how you guys presented the Eliza House made people want to have that experience. So I feel like you guys played such a huge role in the reputation of the hauntings. Can you guys describe your first experience storytelling?
The first time we had we were doing it with Laura. She dressed in a white lace Victorian
Lady in White.
Addis, and we called her the Lady in White because when Eliza has been seen in the house, that's how she was dressed.
Okay, I see.
But the very first experience I had was we would when we go into the house when we're setting up for the tours, we look at the house. Okay, how is it when we come in? Because we try to leave it exactly the same when we leave. And there was at the back of the foyer, there was a little, like a half bath. And you could get into that half bath either from the foyer or you could go around through the music room and get in from the other side. So when we were getting ready before the first tour got there, I closed the hallway door because, I didn't want anybody to get sidetracked into the bathroom and everything. But at the end of the night, we were going through and I was trying to open the bathroom door and it would not budge. I mean, I pushed against it. The knob wouldn't budge, the door wouldn't budge. I went around, came in from the other side, the door would not open, and I was getting kind of frustrated with it. And finally, just before we left, I said, "Eliza, would you please open the bathroom door?" I walked back to the door, the knob turned, and the door opened right up.
Wow.
So that was my very first experience.
The biggest one was the year he worked for the museum. He could not be on the tour, couldn't do the story. Peter's friend from the outlet mall came down, and her and I divided it up. I did the inside, she did the outside. We're standing inside talking, groups left, and we hear this noise coming from upstairs. Well, we call out to Mr. Lynch's sons because one of them had been there. Well, he'd gone, his car was gone. And we stood there and looked at each other, and the noise happened again. When he showed up, he came around with the next tour group. He's like, "What are you girls doing out here on the steps?" And we're like, "We're not going in there until you guys go in with us." And I told him, I said, "Eliza's upset because you're not here telling the story."
I told the group, I said, okay, said, here's the deal. Apparently, Eliza is upset that I'm not here telling the stories. So
Have to check in with her.
you've got me telling you the stories for Eliza this trip. And so I did it, and the rest of the night was fine.
Did you have people who, I guess, came back and said like, "Oh, I was here last year," and share with you that they're back because they wanted to?
Oh yeah, definitely. Because that's one of the first questions we'd ask when the group would get there.
Mm,
Um,
Poor
you
people. I'd
know,
ask it outside, and then
yeah.
he'd ask it inside.
How many of y'all have been on the tour before?
right.
And a lot of times, anywhere from a quarter to half of the people on the tour were returning.
Hmm.
And um and one of the reasons was back and this was before I was the lead storyteller there, when Laura was there, was a story she was telling in an incident that occurred. And now on a tour, we only have I think they have like a maximum of 25 in a group. Well, back then, it wasn't unknown to have 40 people in a group.
Oh,
And
wow.
so when we got everybody into the foyer, I mean, it was like, you know, come on in, you're going to get real friendly with people in here because you're going to be packed in.
Yeah.
And Laura was telling one of the stories, and there was a picture up on the wall, and um and everybody who has been on the tours before the house was renovated, if you ask them about this picture, they'll remember it. It was
Hmm.
in a triangular frame. In order to understand this, you have to know that, okay, when you walked into the foyer, staircase was on the left. So it went up, and then you walked around on the second floor and back around and went up again to the third floor. So there was an open in between the banisters. There was like a 6 or 8 inch opening from the top down to the bottom. So she's turning around, pointing at this picture, explaining this picture, and all of a sudden everybody's murmuring and oohing and awing. And she turns around to see what's going on, and there's a lace collar floating down through in between the staircases. And it would get when it gets down to her, it drifts sideways over to her and drapes itself across her shoulder.
Wow.
And so when we heard about this, was like, that doesn't how does that happen? We
Right.
tried to recreate it. Okay. So we'd get up and we'd drop it down and everything else because it
Right.
was stored in a bureau up on the third floor.
Oh, okay.
And uh, so with Mr. and Mrs. Lynch and a couple people from the museum were trying to recreate this, and it just won't. We'd even put a weight on it, and it wouldn't even drop all the way through. And if it had, how did it get over onto her shoulder.
Right.
So we like to think that maybe that was a sign from Eliza that she appreciated the way we were telling her story.
Yeah.
Because every year after that, Mrs. Lynch would be sure to hang that lace collar up on one of the picture frames so everybody could see it. And then for years after that, there would be usually at least one or two people on the tour who were there and witnessed it.
Yeah.
And they would verify it.
What do you find rewarding about sharing these stories?
We combine some history along with the stories of the house. And I understand that not everybody believes in paranormal or spirits or anything else. And, it's like, whether you believe or whether you don't believe, is up to you. We're just telling you what's happening. And there's a lot of times where, I'll have a couple people who are like, wow, I didn't really believe this before, but uh, now I think I believe. And of course, especially if something happens on the tour, then, we have a lot more people who start believing. It's more than just, a lot of places you'll go, you take a tour through a historic house or something, and
Right.
depending on the guide, you just get and this is where they did this, and this is where they did that. And then you have your guides who really put you there. And that's what I try to do.
I didn't grow up in Leesburg. I grew up in the Pittsburgh area, but I moved here by way of marriage. But I've been here a long time, so this is my home. I might as well have grew up here. So it's nice to be able to tell the stories of where I live, where I've been since I was a pup. And you have people that don't believe you, but by the time they leave, especially if something happens, they're like, I don't believe that. And somebody else will say, oh no, that happened when we were here last year.
Right.
So you have a lot of people that will say it really did happen.
Like you guys have a chance to like bring light to these stories, being like they're not over. Like it's still happening. There's still a story here. It still matters. These aren't just old houses.
Well, it also didn't hurt the fact that the house looked the part. If you look at the older pictures before Sharon bought it, it was dark gray and it had dark green trim and everything. So at nighttime, it looked very scary, very spooky.
Right.
Because I would tell people when you go across the street to Glenn Fittich house, turn around on the driveway and look at the house.
Right.
And it just gives you that,
Yeah.
haunted house vibe. People have seen now, like I said, the only lights we have in the house are are in the foyer. And the last couple years that we were able to get in the house, the only lights we had in the foyer, I had candle lanterns on the steps, and
Yes.
that was it. But before that, the rest of the house was dark. And there were several years where people would come back and say there was a light there was a flickering light in one of the upstairs windows.
There was nobody up
So,
there.
um, and several people had pictures of it, and they would show us pictures, and it's like, okay, well, it was usually on the third floor. So, like I said earlier, there's more than one spirit in the house, and we think the one on the third floor is a soldier, and we think maybe that was him with a lantern.
And it was built in, I don't really know.
1850 in the
Right before the war.
1850.
Okay.
If you go around, if you're looking at the house, if you go around to the left side, you'll see it looks like a seam running down the side of the house. That seam, from that seam forward, is post-war,
Okay.
post-Civil War. Because they actually had a big front yard.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Um, and there's two staircases in the house. There's the main staircase. If you go in now, there's a main staircase from the foyer.
Mhm.
If you go back through the parlor, there's another staircase going up to the second floor.
Mm.
And that's where the light is that Eliza would use to signal her displeasure if I talk too much about the war.
Didn't someone either volunteer or maybe someone on the tour come in dressed in a uniform and got a little like pinched?
We had a young man who was one of the guides, and on the first night of the tour, he was dressed in a Yankee uniform. And this was one of the years where we had a lot of people.
Mhm.
And so he came in and he closed the front doors, and then he was leaning against the door. Well, as I was telling the stories, every once in a while I'd glance at him. I noticed he had this funny look on his face. And he came up to me as everybody was leaving, and he said, "The whole time you were up there talking, it felt like somebody's hand was in my chest trying to push me out the door." And I looked at him and I said, "Well, what are you wearing?" Because I was wearing a Confederate officer's uniform.
Right.
And I said, "Look at what you're wearing."
Mm.
And he's like, "Oh, okay." So he came back on the tours the next night. He wasn't a guide, but he brought his girlfriend with him for moral support.
Mhm.
But this time he was wearing a Confederate uniform,
Mhm.
and his lady friend had a period ball gown on.
Mhm.
So they were standing back in the music room
Mhm.
because, the period dresses, they took up a lot of room with the hoop skirts and stuff.
Yes.
So when the stories were over and everybody was leaving, he took his lady friend
Mm.
and he took her by the arm, and they stepped up into the doorway waiting for everybody to come out. And he felt something on his other shoulder, and he looks over and he sees a young woman's hand on his shoulder.
Oh my gosh, yes, yes. Okay.
And at first he's like, "Oh, okay, it's my girlfriend's hand." And then all of a
Oh,
sudden he realizes that he's holding her hand. And then the young lady who was wearing a bonnet, all of a sudden it's like somebody was flicking the brim of her bonnet.
oh my goodness.
And we attributed that to Eliza may have been getting a little catty with the girlfriend and
Mhm.
maybe trying to make up to him for trying to shove him out of the house the night before.
Do you guys have any other behind the scenes stories?
Oh,
Your
okay.
experience? I know there's probably a lot, but do you have any, I guess, that stand out?
We had one night, the Lynches, um, they were into the theater. They were both retired, but they were both heavy into the theater, and they traveled all over the place. So the house was sort of like a museum.
It was beautiful.
Um, But one of the things they had inside the door in the corner of the foyer, they had a big umbrella stand filled with all different types of umbrellas that they had brought back from around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And one night, standing there telling the stories, and all of a sudden, all of the umbrellas that were in that stand floated up.
Oh my
And
goodness.
they're just hanging there in a bunch.
Right.
And I'm standing there talking, and all of a sudden it's like, really? And I'm like, am I really seeing this? And of course, everybody's standing in front of me. They're all looking at me. This is behind everybody. Everybody's looking at me, and they're, wondering why I stopped talking. And then somebody turns around and um, screams,
Yeah.
and all the umbrellas drop back into the umbrellas. And they did, you would think that, if you had a dozen or more umbrellas hanging up and they drop, they just go everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Oh, right
It's
back down into the stand.
like Mary Poppins.
And now she's standing out front waiting for the next group, or the next group might have gotten there already. And it was like, one woman screamed, people saw it, the umbrellas dropped, and
The door
the
opened.
door opened up and they were gone. I usually run over my time.
Big time.
The tours always get backed up at Eliza's house. So one of the things we did to help alleviate that was, if the next group got there, she would take them a little bit past the house and she would do the first half of the story. Then I would tell them of all the happenings and everything with Eliza. And it was kind of funny because um, when there was another group coming up the walk, she would come up on the porch and she would knock on the door.
Oh, yeah.
That's
And,
funny.
everybody's engrossed in the stories and everything. And all of a sudden there's this knock on the door
Oh,
and people
right.
would,
Jump.
yes, if they experience something on it, it's like, now they can go back and tell their friends. And of course, that's a good thing for us because word of mouth builds.
Right.
And, oh, when are the next hauntings? The Lynches bought the house and moved in. When we talk about Patrick, the son, who was the first one to see Eliza, um, I'll find, because lots of people bring their kids on the tours, and I'll try and find somebody who looks to be about Patrick's age.
Mm-hmm.
And when we're talking about it, I'll say he was about your age. I try to, like, I try to make it personal. I try to get them engaged in it. Um, and there are times when it's hard to do that. In the incident with the light, I was standing on the steps and had a group of Boy Scouts that were on the tour. And they were standing at the foot of the steps in the doorway to the park. And so, I mentioned the fact that, um, she gets upset if we talk about the Civil War too long. Well, when I start telling them about, this was back when we did the whole thing inside. So what did I do? I ended up droning on about the war.
Mhm.
Well, so these kids are standing at the foot of the steps and they're looking at me and then they're ducking into the room and then back and.
Mhm.
And then one of them goes, the light's flashing, the light's flashing. 'Cause I thought, it was because the traffic up and down King Street, there
Yeah.
was a mirror over the fireplace and, it would flash every once in a while from the headlights. And so the group left, and she comes out of the parlor and she's like, no, they were right. Says you were talking about the war, and that light back in the hallway was glowing on and off
And then you
until
stopped breathing when that happened.
until you stopped talking about the war. So I apologized to Eliza, and everything was,
Goodness.
and I can look at people's faces and I can tell whether or not they're accepting this. We did have one instance where we had a woman on the tour. She was supposedly a paranormal.
Mm.
And as the stories were going on, she was getting, now this is back when the Lynches still owned it, she was getting more and more agitated.
Mm.
And when the stories were over, she came up and started berating the storyteller. Why is she still here? Why haven't you made her move on? She needs to be cast out,
Mm.
and so forth. And we tried to explain to this lady that, first of all, this is not our house. The Lynches loan us their house for the
Mhm.
evenings, and they are perfectly content with Eliza being there.
Right.
And this just made her that much angrier.
Mm.
And so she turns around in a huff and goes to storm out and says, um, this is not over. I will be back and we will take care of this. So we closed up. The Lynches didn't get home till much later.
Mm-hmm.
But the next morning, Mr. Lynch came down to the museum and asked if anything had happened
Mm-hmm.
during the tours. And they said, well, yeah, we did have this problem with this one woman. And they explained everything to him, and he said, okay. Says, well, that explains what happened last night. Says, yes, says we got home late. We went to bed, and sometime during the night, Mrs. Lynch woke up and heard a young lady crying.
Mm-hmm.
And she sat up in bed and she heard the crying, and then she heard, please don't let them make me leave my home. I
Oh.
don't want to leave my home.
Mm.
In all the years, that's the only time they ever heard her voice.
Yeah.
Wow. Despite having those challenges like with people, do you guys have any other challenges that you guys experienced when it came to being storytellers?
My biggest problem is there is so much that I can talk about
Right.
there that's happened. And if I'm standing there telling you a story, my mind is already three stories ahead, trying to figure out, trying to sort out which stories I'm going to tell.
How do you adapt your storytelling style for different audiences?
Well, when the group comes in, now she's already, gone over the history part of it.
Right.
So we get them inside, and of course, I'll be standing up the stairs and I'm watching everybody as they come in, and it's like, you could tell the ones who are looking around, the ones who look generally interested in the surroundings and stuff. And then you have, the people who come in and they're sort of chuckling and they're talking to themselves and stuff like that.
Have a little too much to drink.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a
We had that.
that's an occupational hazard. But I've never really had that much of a problem with those people.
Mm.
But I'll look at, it's sort of like reading the room, and what I think um will interest them the most. Um because if I have a lot of kids in the group, I'll tell them the hat story.
I think what is so funny about Eliza from all these stories from the behind the scenes is she just has such a distinct personality to me.
Oh, and she would
So
take pictures down to clean before we'd show up and just leave them lay there. And the next morning get up and the pictures were back sitting against the walls to where they were supposed to be hung up.
Wow, that's
That
crazy.
was one thing I always would tell the kids because I'm like, don't you wish your homework would do that, or what you're supposed to be doing at home would do that?
Right. Like you guys told the story as like not scaring the kids, but
Yeah. I don't want to scare
at
them.
least at least at our stop, and probably most of the stops, we're
yeah,
not necessarily trying to scare people.
right,
This isn't, you know, Shocktober or any of those things.
right.
Um, Basically, we're bringing you in, we're
Mhm.
telling you stuff that has gone on in the past, and occasionally something happens while you're there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, you know, so we call it the hauntings, and these are, these are haunted spaces, but it's not a scary haunting.
Right.
Well, for some people it is because you mentioned ghosts and you know,
Right. It's just more about like the world of what it once was. But what is the ultimate goal when it comes to being a storyteller? What do you hope that people leave?
hopefully when you leave, depending on what you believe when you walked in the door. I mean, if you already believe, you know,
Have faith.
you have more stories to tell your friends.
Hmm.
If you come in not believing, and if you leave with at least, well, maybe,
Hmm.
okay, that's a good thing. There's always going to be people who they don't believe when they walk in and they still don't believe when they walk out, and that's okay.
Right.
Okay. Um, I'm giving you the stories.
Hmm.
Uh, you can think about the stories and make your own decisions
Right.
about, how it goes in. And now you know a little bit more history about the town and everything else.
If someone's listening to this and they're thinking, oh, I want to volunteer to maybe be a storyteller, what advice would you give someone who wants to participate in the hauntings as a storyteller?
Planning for the hauntings usually starts back in June. So if you're interested in becoming involved with it, um, the best thing I could tell you to do is, to get involved with it is volunteer to be a guide or a sweep.
Yeah, for the first time at least.
Um, because with that, you're going around to all the sites, you're hearing all the stories and everything else. And there might be something, that really interests you, whether it's Eliza's house, the courthouse, wherever. And um, so then, you can start, looking up and you can say, hey, I think uh this is interesting. Could I maybe do this?
Right.
My first time,
Okay.
though, with the museum, I was a tour guide. And after that, I'm like, Rick, I don't want to do the tour anymore. And he said, then be a storyteller. And that's how I got
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Because yeah, I mean, if somebody's interested, just call the museum, say, hey, look, okay, um, I'm interested in this. What can I do? What can I do to help? And they'll put you on a list.
Yeah, they're not going to turn you
Okay.
down because they need
Um,
help.
and if you decide you want to be a storyteller, it's it's very important that you know your story. And not only do you know the story, but also the history that goes along with it. Um, because Now, when I first started as a storyteller, I was working with Laura, okay? And a lot of what I learned came from her because I would sit and listen to her telling the stories, and that's what I drew from when I started telling the stories on my own.
I just want to thank you guys. Thank you guys so much for being such great storytellers, and for all the work you guys have put in the past. It has definitely made Hauntings what it is today. I feel like people want to come back because of storytellers like you guys. So we really appreciate it. So much more that we could discuss when it comes to this topic. It's been so interesting to hear the behind the scenes of what you guys have experienced as storytellers in that house. And I'm sure we're going to have a lot of listeners listening to this and just wanting to know more. So in the future, I hope we get a chance to just explore more topics when it comes to this. Thank you for listening to the Loudoun Museum podcast. While the Eliza House is not a part of our tour this year, their stories remain an essential part of our local history. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast on YouTube for more insights into Loudoun's past. We look forward to sharing more captivating stories with you soon. Until next time, see you at the museum.